Hey everyone. Okay, so this maybe is a little bit crazy here. It's New Year's Eve. It's December 31st, 2019. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of a behind the scenes view of what goes on here at the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I am in my podcast studio, and I have been working on this week's show, which is going to be up tomorrow, since it's New Year's Day. I thought it was a good time to do a best of 2019 look back episode and also share some reflections and such. But I thought it would be really fun to record my remarks for the show here in the studio and at the same time broadcast live on Facebook. Just to kind of give you guys a behind the scenes view of what goes on here at the show. So, I've never done this before. We'll see what happens. I've made a few notes here of what I want to talk about, but it is live and unscripted. So here we go. I'm here in the studio. You can see I have these on because this is what I use for editing and putting the show together. Today I've been putting together various clips to put into the show, and this is the microphone that I use for recording the show, and this is the microphone here that's broadcasting to Facebook, and then so that's it. So I will record the remarks as if I'm talking to the podcast audience, and if you listen to this episode tomorrow, you'll hear these remarks at the start of the show. So what I do is I'm on my laptop here. I go over to Audacity and I hit record, and then I'm going to flip back to my notes here. I can obviously cut this part out when I'm doing it. Sorry, my hair is falling out of my thing here. It's going to fall in my face. All right. So here we go. I guess it's a one-time only. We'll see what happens. All right. Here we go. Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 50 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So as I record this, it's New Year's Eve. It's December 31st, 2019, and I'm headed to a friend's house in a little bit for a New Year's party with some other families, so looking forward to that. But today I have been working on this week's show, and I'm trying something new. So if you're listening to this tomorrow on the show, you'll be hearing the audio piece. But right now I am also simultaneously broadcasting live on Facebook. So there's a video that, some people you can watch live now if you happen to be on. It'll be on my Facebook timeline later. And so, by the way, if we are not connected on social media, you can find me at LiskJenny, LiskJenny, and that's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And then the video will also be on my YouTube channel later. So, yes, I have a YouTube channel. I haven't talked about it very much so far because I've been trying to build out the content for that, and I didn't want to share it until I had some good stuff there for you guys. I'm still building it out, but I want to go ahead and tell you about it anyway so you can jump in and get an early look. I do have most of my podcast episodes there, which you can listen to. It's audio only, but you can listen on YouTube. Also some behind the scenes videos, also starting to do some book reviews. I read an awful lot of interesting books as I prepare for interviews and learn about the subject, so I'm going to start reviewing more and more of those as videos as well on YouTube, and also working on something I'm really excited about for 2020, which is adding listener recommendations to my YouTube channel. So right now testing that out with a few listeners and just trying to get some content created, so be on the lookout for that. Probably able to talk about that more in the coming weeks. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah, it's kind of funny that I have a YouTube channel. I still remember, and I believe it was back in 2006 when my neighbor in Portland at the time said, "Hey, there's this new thing called YouTube." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, anybody can create a video and share it with the world." And I remember saying, "Really? Like, why would you want to do that?" And look, here I am. What is this? 13 years later with a YouTube channel that I'm starting. So anyway, speaking of the past, the decade change that's happening now here in a few hours in my time zone. I guess sooner if you're in a different time zone, or maybe if you're one of my listeners in Europe or Australia, some other place you may already be in 2020 by the time you hear this. Anyway, I've been thinking about this concept of a decade change, and the first time I had a decade change was 1979, so that's going to date me a little bit here, I guess, but I was 7, approaching 8, and I remember my grandmother saying that it was the end of a decade. And at that point, I didn't even know what a decade was, so I didn't even know that that was a thing that, you might think about chunks of decades and use it as a chance to look back or look ahead. The next decade would have been 1989, New Year's Eve. I was a senior in high school and playing a lot of basketball on my high school team. And I remember writing a lot of college application essays that break, so I'm sure I was quite busy with that. The next decade changed, 1989. So the 90s for me, if the 80s were basically my entire, not early childhood, but the childhood that I remember plus my teenage years, and the 90s then were college and young adult years, and that's when I met my husband and we got married in 98. I remember the changeover in 1989. Maybe some of you remember all of the hysteria about Y2K. I was working at a large tech company at the time, and there was a lot of concern. Nobody knew exactly what was going to happen and whether elevators would stop working and airplanes would fall out of the sky and banking systems would explode. So one of my first assignments was to make contingency plans in case bad things happen to all of our various systems around the world. And so I remember two things about New Year's Eve 1999, which I have to say, it does not seem like 2 decade changes ago. It seems like 1 decade change ago. But here we are. But I remember watching the new year roll in around the globe and watching all of our systems to see if there were any problems in some of the earlier time zones where it hit the new year in Australia and then in Asia, and as we got around to Europe and we were hitting the new year and nothing really bad was happening. I was then free to go to a really big, exciting, fun New Year's Eve party, which was at originally it was called the Glen Island Casino. I believe at that point it was called the Glen Island Country Club, but it's where Glenn Miller played way back in the day. And we were just, fairly new to New York, and it seemed like an exciting time to do something big and classy and classic like that. I think it was a black tie affair. We went with some family and some friends, and had a great time. Swing dancing, terrific food, just a really exciting way to ring in not only the new year, the new decade, the new century, and the new millennium, which sometimes I forget that it was actually a millennium change too. Not very many people get to live through that, but probably most of you, my listeners, obviously did live through that. But it's weird to think that my kids did not. They were born after that point. The decade changed, New Year's 2009. I don't remember what we were doing that particular New Year's Eve, but I do remember as far as a time in life that's, we had 2 small kids, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and a dog and a cat, and we each had jobs and we had a house, and we were doing the normal life of a family with young children. But the 2010s, well, I guess it's the 20-teens for me, and I'm guessing probably for many of my listeners, the 20-teens is when everything changed. So I think most of my listeners have lost their spouse within the past decade. So, and meaning, we started this past decade as, in my case, a family of 4, ended the decade as a family of 3, ended the decade with everything 180 degrees different than it was at the start of the decade. This is the year everything fell apart, big changes, and I look back on it and I think it's it's time to oh, what am I trying to say? I don't know. I think that it's useful to think about the next decade and think about, now that I'm here. In my case, my loss was, it'll be 4 years ago next week. Something that I talked about, actually, not a lot on this podcast, but I was a guest on another podcast, the Life Through Transitions podcast with John DeWall. Terrific podcast if you have a chance to listen. He's got some really interesting guests. Anyway, this idea that we now finding ourselves, here now, if we lost our spouses, we have to choose what the next steps look like, what the next days, weeks, months, years, what the next decade really looks like. And it's kind of a two-sided coin. I mean, we, as much as we would want to erase these changes of the past decade, erase what happened, wave a magic wand and restore things to the way they were at the start of the decade, the fact is we can't do that, no matter how badly we want to. So that means we have to choose what next looks like. And the kind of the flip side of the coin is we get to choose what next looks like. So, it's a burden and an opportunity. Where all of us are in a life we didn't choose, and now we get to choose what's next. I hope that makes sense. So I'm thinking about, I don't know what I want my life to look like when the next decade closes out. I heard another podcaster mention recently, as we're closing out 2029, a decade from now, what do we want our lives to look like? I don't know, but I know my life will look really different because my kids a decade from now will be 23 and 25. So I know there'll be huge changes in store for our family, whatever that might be. I don't know exactly what it'll be, but I know they'll be in different places. I'll probably be in a different place. I don't necessarily mean geographically, but, a different place in life. So I don't know what it looks like, and I don't think I have to know, but I think it's a worthwhile exercise, and I'd encourage you maybe to think about it if you have some, spare brain cycles as you're driving around or whatever you're doing, to think about, maybe defining some of these next steps and what comes next for you. It's hard to think, I think, about, what life is going to be like in a decade. I'm finding it easier to think about the coming year, so I wanted to share with you a little bit about that. Lots of exciting stuff coming up for the podcast. I think it's going to be the year of creating things. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, you won't be able to see the shirt I'm wearing. If you're watching on the video, I'll show you here. I think it's backwards, it's hard to see, but it says create every day. And it's actually my email provider sent me the shirt, but it's cool nonetheless. I love it. I wear it all the time. In fact, I might need to get another one. I think it's going to be the year of creating every day. I'll still be creating, of course, a weekly show for you guys. So there's a lot of creative work in that. It's funny, I did this just to go on a slight diversion. What do you call it? I can't think of what it's called. The VIA, the VIA character survey, where you answer all these questions and it comes up with kind of what your character strengths are and ranks them. And so creativity came up as one of my top ones. So anyway, there's a lot of creativity that goes into creating the show every week, thinking about the topics and researching them and how to put together a good discussion and story and set of information for you guys. So I look forward to continuing to create in that way. And then I'm also creating not one, but 2 books. I may be talking to you a year from now and saying, yeah, that was crazy, that didn't happen. But as of right now, my intention is to publish the first book, which is a memoir, in April, and the second book, which is the Widowed Parent Handbook, in November. And so the memoir, tentatively, my working title is Cancer and Caregiving, Helping My Young Family Survive My Husband's Terminal Illness. I'm not sure if I'm going to stick with that title, but I'm definitely framing it in terms of, look back. It's based on my Caring Bridge journal, but looking back at, it's kind of like the predecessor to the podcast of the widowed parenting piece, but how do you parent through a terminal illness as the spouse who is the one who's going to be the surviving spouse? What does that look like, and what do I wish I had done differently, and things like that. The second book, the handbook, so this podcast is actually research for the handbook. It's tentatively titled The Widowed Parent Handbook, a guide for widowed parents to increase their family's well-being. So I'm really excited about this one, and actually one of my tasks for this month is to try to create an outline for the book, which I've just been going around in circles trying to figure out what the outline should be, because it's such a broad topic, and I need to kind of narrow it down to a framework that makes sense. But anyway, I think I'm going to launch it in November because that's Children's Grief Awareness Month, so it seems like a perfect time to launch it. On the other hand, it just occurred to me a few days ago that November 2020 is also, at least in the US here, a very large election, which will be very distracting. So it might not be the perfect time to launch a book, but I'm thinking with it being Children's Grief Awareness Month, I'll probably stick with November as the goal, but I'll have to give that one some more thought. Anyway, so lots of things I'm working on creating for you guys, and looking very much forward to that over the coming year. So as far as this week's show, so this is actually my first solo show. If you've been listening for a while, you'll notice that every single episode is an interview with somebody, a guest, an expert perhaps, somebody who's written a book, somebody who runs a grief center. Some are interviews with people who lost a parent when they were young and hearing their reflections and their journeys, and some are interviews with fellow widowed parents who are down the path a bit and can share their reflections and journeys. So, but this week I'm doing a solo show, my first one. So it's been kind of fun to put it together. It's a look back at the best of 2019. So I was going to do a top 5 and pick out top 5 episodes to make some comments and then share clips from those episodes. And I was pulling together my list, and I narrowed it down to 6, and I just couldn't cut any of them to make it 5. And then I thought, well, who says it has to be 5, right? I mean, I decided it's my show. If I want it to be 6, it's going to be 6. So there you go. It's the top 6. But I guess if you think of it as a half dozen, then I guess maybe it's not such a random number. Anyway, for each clip here coming up, I will make some remarks introducing the clip, and maybe about some things I learned from the guest, and then I will play a clip from that episode. And in the show notes, I will put all of the links to the episodes that we talk about in this week's show, and links to the books, in the cases of people who wrote books, link to those as well, and any other kind of key resources that come up in the course of the discussion. So I hope you enjoy listening to this week's show as much as I enjoyed putting it together. So, on to this week's show. Okay, so now, for those of you still on Facebook, still with me, I'm going to stop the recording. Stop. Hit the wrong button. Okay, so yikes, that was like 16 minutes. So, as far as a behind-the-scenes look here, usually my introductory remarks are much shorter than that, because usually the meat of an episode is the interview itself. So usually each week what I do is I put together, I go through and I edit the interview, which, I don't do a lot of like slicing and dicing and picking and choosing. I do, take out weird sounds. Sometimes there's a reason we have to restart and I have to cut out a piece, but mostly I try to run them end to end. But then I also record 2 different segments. So after I go through and I make notes and the key points and the bullet points to put in the show notes page and the links, whatever we talked about, websites, resources, books, anything we talked about that's a good resource for listeners, I make notes of all that to put on the show notes. And then what? Oh, then I record some remarks to put at the beginning, usually talk about what I learned from the guest and why it was such a great discussion, what I think listeners might want to listen for while they're listening. I record that, and then separately I record some closing remarks, which usually is a kind of a look ahead of some things that are coming up, maybe what's coming up in next week's show, maybe some other comments about things going on in the discussion group, other things I might want to mention. So and then I pull it all together. So I have a master file in Audacity here. If you have been listening, you'll know there's music at the beginning, music at the end. There's a voiceover guy who does a welcome at the beginning and a thing at the end. Somebody asked me recently who the voiceover guy was. It's not... Oops, I hit the microphone. It's actually a voiceover guy in Fiverr that I hired who does freelance voiceover work. So I thought he had a good sound and a good voice for what I was looking for the opening and closing of the show. So I got him to record that. And I love the music. I found it on, what's it called? I don't know, some website where you can buy music, that you can buy the rights then to use it in a show like this. So I spent a lot of time looking for the music for that. So anyway, once I have all these clips, I put them together and do the final editing in Audacity, and then I post it. So that was a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look into how I produce the show. So next, I'm gonna end this video. Look for the video on YouTube, and I will take the remarks that I just made, listen back through, see if there's anything weird, any sounds I have to cut out or anything like that, and get them incorporated into the show, and do the final balancing of the volume and all these exciting things, and the other final steps to get it published. And then I'll work on my email for to send out to listeners this week. So if you're not on my email list, by the way, really easy to get on my list at my website, jennylisk.com, JENNYLISK.com. And on just about every page, there's a little form at the bottom where you can put your name and your email. And then you make sure you get, a notice each week when I have a new show. So I think that's all for the behind the scenes look. Thank you for watching, and Happy New Year. See you in 2020. Bye.